There are things that exist in the space between science and faith. Things that cannot be measured in laboratories or explained by textbooks, but that anyone who has stood at the edge of death will tell you are real. And at the Steere House Nursing and Rehabilitation Center in Providence, Rhode Island, that thing has 4 legs and orange fur and answers to the name Oscar. And Oscar has a job that no doctor applied for and no nurse can fully explain, which is to know, with a certainty that borders on supernatural, exactly when someone is going to die, and he has been right more than 200 times. The story begins in 2005. Begins with a decision by the Hospice administration to adopt a kitten for pet therapy, for the comfort and companionship that animals provide to people who are spending their final days in institutional rooms that smell like antiseptic and sound like ventilators. And they chose Oscar from a local shelter. Chose this small tabby cat who seemed unremarkable in every way, except for his complete lack of interest in being petted or held, or engaging in any of the behaviors that typically make therapy animals effective. And the staff joked that they had adopted the worst therapy cat in history because Oscar actively avoided patients, would walk past extended hands without acknowledgement, would leave rooms when people tried to interact with him. But 6 months after his arrival, something changed. Something that the night shift nurse Mary Augustine noticed first during her rounds at 2 in the morning when she found Oscar sitting on the bed of Mrs. Eleanor Hendricks in room 237. Sitting in a way he had never sat with anyone before, curled against her legs. Purring so loudly Mary could hear it from the doorway, and Mary thought, this is strange. Thought Oscar has never shown interest in Eleanor or anyone else. And she made a note in her chart and continued her rounds. And 4 hours later, Eleanor Hendricks died. Died peacefully in her sleep with no warning signs that her death was imminent. Died while Oscar sat vigil in a way that seemed deliberate, purposeful. If you have ever stood beside someone in their final moments, if you have ever wondered whether death comes as a surprise or as an expected guest that some can sense before others, subscribe to this channel right now, because what happened over the next 12 years at Steere House will challenge everything you think you know about the boundary between life and death and the creatures who can see across that boundary more clearly than we can. Hit that like button if you believe some knowledge exists beyond human understanding. And drop a comment telling me what city and country you are watching from. Because this story belongs to everyone who has ever wondered if we are truly alone when we die. The staff dismissed the incident as coincidence. Dismissed it because coincidences happen in hospice care all the time. But 2 weeks later it happened again. Oscar appeared in the room of Thomas Chun, a man who had been stable for days. Appeared and settled onto his bed and began his purring vigil. And 3 hours later Thomas Chun stopped breathing. And Oscar remained on the bed until the body was cold. Remained until the funeral home staff arrived. And only then did Oscar jump down and walk out as if his shift had ended. And Nurse Mary Augustine began keeping a separate log. Began documenting every time Oscar chose to sit with a patient. And over the next 3 months, the pattern became undeniable because Oscar was right every single time. Would enter a room and settle onto a bed, and within 2 to 6 hours that patient would die. Dr. Alan Morrison was a skeptic, had been a physician for 30 years, and had no patience for superstition. And he told the nursing staff that they were engaging in confirmation bias, were seeing patterns in randomness. And he asked them to document every room Oscar entered and every outcome. And he predicted the data would show Oscar was no more accurate than random chance. And he was wrong, was completely wrong. Because over the next 6 months, Oscar sat with 43 patients and 43 patients died. And Oscar never sat with a patient who survived, never made a mistake. Never showed interest in someone who was not within hours of death. And Dr. Morrison became one of Oscar's most vocal advocates. Became someone who had to reconcile his scientific training with evidence that defied explanation. The nurses began to trust Oscar more than they trusted medical indicators. Began to watch where he went during their shifts, because Oscar became a more reliable predictor of imminent death than blood pressure or respiration rate. And they developed an unofficial protocol. Developed it quietly without administrative approval. And the protocol was simple. If Oscar enters a room and stays for more than 10 minutes, call the family immediately. Tell them that if they want to say goodbye, they need to come now, not tomorrow now. Because Oscar is never wrong, and time is always shorter than it seems. And there were families who arrived in time because of Oscar. Arrived in time to hold hands and speak final words. And there were families who did not believe that a cat could possibly know what trained professionals did not know. And those families carried regret that the nurses could see in their faces. The media discovered Oscar in 2007 when a doctor wrote an essay about the phenomenon for the New England Journal of Medicine. Wrote it with careful language, knowing how absurd the story sounds, but unable to deny the data. And the essay went viral, and suddenly reporters were calling asking to photograph Oscar. Asking the nurses to explain how a cat could possibly know when death was approaching. And the nurses had no explanation beyond what they had observed. Beyond the undeniable fact that Oscar knew something they did not, and theories emerged. Theories that Oscar might be detecting chemical changes that occur before death. Detecting ketones or compounds that the body releases when organ systems begin their shutdown. Detecting them the way dogs can detect cancer or seizures. And this theory satisfied some people because it made Oscar seem less supernatural and more biological. But there were nurses who said it was more than chemistry. Nurses who had seen Oscar walk past rooms where patients were actively dying to sit with patients who seemed stable, who had good vitals and no obvious signs of decline. And hours later, those stable patients would crash, would spiral with a suddenness that surprised everyone except Oscar. And the nurses who believed in things beyond biology said that Oscar was not detecting death. He was attending it, was serving as a guide or guardian or witness to something that humans could only glimpse. And these conversations happened in quiet moments during night shifts because they knew how it sounded. Knew it invited skepticism, but they also knew what they had seen. Sarah Chun was 47 years old when she entered hospice care at Steere House with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, and her daughter Lisa visited every day. And Sarah was still lucid, still able to hold conversations. Still seemed like someone who had time left. And Lisa had planned to visit the next morning. And that evening at 7:43, Oscar entered room 319 and jumped onto Sarah Chun's bed and curled against her side and began to purr. And the nurse called Lisa immediately and said in the gentle voice that hospice nurses develop, "Your mother is not in distress, but I think you should come now." And Lisa drove through rush hour traffic with shaking hands and arrived at 8:30 to find her mother still conscious, still able to smile, still able to hold her hand. And Oscar was there on the bed, and Sarah looked at the cat and then at her daughter and said, "I did not want to die alone." Said it with relief, with gratitude. And Lisa said, "You are not alone, Mom. I am here." And Sarah said, "I know. But he knew to come get you. He knew I needed you both." Sarah Chun died at 9:17 that evening holding her daughter's hand while Oscar purred against her ribs. Died with a peacefulness that Lisa had not seen in months. And after Sarah stopped breathing, Oscar remained for another 10 minutes. Remained until Lisa's tears had slowed and she had kissed her mother's forehead and said goodbye. And only then did Oscar jump down and leave the room. And Lisa understood why the nurses called Oscar a gift. Understood that her mother's final words were right. That Oscar had somehow known that Sarah needed her daughter there. Needed to not be alone. Needed the comfort of touch and presence in those final moments. And families began requesting Oscar. Began asking if the cat had visited their loved one yet. Began to see his presence not as an omen of death, but as a promise that their family member would not die alone. There was a man named Robert Wilson who had no family. had outlived everyone and had spent his final months being cared for by nurses who were kind but who were not kin. And Robert told Mary Augustine that his greatest fear was dying alone, dying with no one who loved him present, and Mary said, "You will not be alone, Robert." And 2 days later, Oscar entered room 304 and jumped onto Robert's bed. And Mary called the social worker who made desperate calls and found a cousin. Found someone who barely remembered Robert, but who agreed to come. And that cousin arrived an hour before Robert died. Arrived and held his hand and said, "I am here. You are not alone." And Robert died with someone who carried his blood holding his hand and a cat who carried something else, pressed against his side. There was an incident in 2015 that deepened the mystery. An incident involving a woman named Patricia Russo, who had advanced dementia and multiple organ failures and who, by all assessments, was declining steadily but not imminently dying. And Oscar had never shown interest in Patricia, had walked past her room dozens of times. And then one afternoon at 4:20, Oscar suddenly changed direction mid-hallway, turned and walked into Patricia's room with deliberate gait and jumped onto her bed and began his vigil. And the nurse called Patricia's family, even though her vitals had not changed, even though there was no medical reason to predict imminent death, called because Oscar had never been wrong. And Patricia's son Michael drove 4 hours and arrived at 7:30, and his mother was still alive, still breathing steadily, and Oscar was still there. And Michael sat down and held his mother's hand and waited. At 8:45, Patricia opened her eyes for the first time in 3 days and looked at Michael with sudden clarity, with the kind of lucidity that sometimes appears in dementia patients right before death. And Patricia said, "Michael, you came." Said it with recognition and love, and they had 5 minutes. 5 minutes of conversation that Michael had not expected to have. 5 minutes where his mother was present and aware. And then Patricia closed her eyes and died at 8:52. Died almost exactly 4.5 hours after Oscar had entered her room. And Michael left that night believing that Oscar had given him a gift that went beyond prediction. Had somehow known that Patricia would have that moment of clarity, that she would need her son there to receive it. Dr. Susan Martinez joined the staff in 2016 with the healthy skepticism of someone trained in evidence-based medicine. Came ready to dismiss Oscar as institutional folklore. And 3 weeks into her tenure, Oscar entered the room of James Patterson during her rounds and jumped onto the bed. And Dr. Martinez examined James and found nothing to suggest imminent death, found a man who was sick but stable. And she made a note that there was no medical indication of approaching death in the next 24 hours. And the nurse on duty was Mary Augustine, who looked at Dr. Martinez and said with respect, "You should call his family now." And Dr. Martinez felt irritation rise, felt frustration at having her judgment questioned by a nurse deferring to a cat. And she said, "I will not call the family based on where a cat chooses to sit." And Mary said nothing more but called the family herself. And James Patterson died 4 hours later with his family present and Dr. Martinez standing in the hallway trying to reconcile what had happened with everything she thought she knew. Dr. Martinez became one of Oscar's most careful observers after that day. Became someone who documented his behavior with scientific rigor. And what she found was that Oscar's accuracy was not just high. It was absolute, was 100% over 12 years. And she wrote a paper about it, knowing it would damage her credibility. Knowing serious physicians do not write papers about psychic cats, but also knowing the data was undeniable. That something was happening that deserved documentation, even if it could not be explained. And she proposed that Oscar might be detecting chemical changes before death. Detecting compounds released as cells begin shutdown. But even she acknowledged this theory struggled to explain why Oscar sometimes bypassed actively dying patients to sit with stable ones who would crash hours later. The staff began to see Oscar not just as a predictor, but as a facilitator. Began to believe his presence helped patients die more peacefully. That his purring and warmth and willingness to stay provided comfort that eased the transition. And they noticed that patients who died with Oscar present seemed to struggle less, seemed to let go more easily, as if having a witness who was not afraid, who did not recoil from death, who simply sat and purred and accepted what was happening. Gave the dying person permission to stop fighting, permission to release their grip on life without feeling abandoned. Mary Augustine retired in 2019 after 40 years of nursing, 11 of them working alongside Oscar. And at her retirement party, she said that Oscar had taught her more about death than any training, had taught her that death is not always violent or tragic, that it can be peaceful and attended and witnessed, that the presence of a creature who is not afraid, who does not flinch or turn away, who simply stays, is one of the greatest gifts you can give to someone who is dying. And she said she hoped when her own time arrived that there would be an Oscar there, some presence that would sit vigil, that would purr and stay and make the transition less lonely. Oscar is 17 years old now, 17, and still working his shifts at Steere House, still making his rounds, still entering rooms with purposefulness. And the staff treats him with reverence that goes beyond usual affection for a facility pet. Treats him like a colleague, like someone who does work that matters. And when Oscar chooses to sit with someone, they no longer question it, no longer doubt. They simply make the calls and prepare the family and ensure someone is present to witness what Oscar already knows. And the hospice has never formally incorporated Oscar into protocols, but everyone who works there knows. The unofficial protocol knows that Oscar's presence is a signal, knows to respond. And this has become so reliable that families will sometimes request Steere House specifically because of Oscar. Because they want that certainty, that warning system, that guarantee their loved one will not die alone. Oscar is slowing down, showing signs of age, moving more stiffly, sleeping more deeply, and the staff watches him with awareness that his own death will eventually come. And they wonder who will attend Oscar when his time arrives. Wonder if there is some other creature who will know when Oscar is dying, the way Oscar knows when humans are dying. And they wonder what will happen at Steere House when Oscar is gone. Whether another cat will develop his abilities or whether Oscar is unique, is singular, is something that will not be repeated. But Oscar is still working, still making rounds. And just last month, he sat with Margaret Foster for 6 hours while her children told her stories about her life. And Margaret died peacefully at dawn with Oscar pressed against her side, and her family surrounding her, and no fear in her face. And her daughter told the nurses she would be forever grateful for Oscar. Grateful that a cat had known what they needed to know. Grateful that because of Oscar, they had not missed their mother's final hours. And if this story has moved you, if you have ever wondered whether death is something we face alone or whether there are presences that guide us through that transition, subscribe to this channel for more true stories about the boundaries we cannot see and the creatures who move between them more easily than we do. Hit that like button if you believe that some forms of knowledge exist beyond science. And leave a comment sharing a time when an animal knew something they should not have been able to know, because these stories matter. These moments of mystery remind us that the world is stranger and more full of grace than we typically acknowledge. They remind us that death can be attended with dignity and presence, and even with purring. And that perhaps the greatest gift we can give to someone who is dying is simply to stay, to witness, to be present without fear, the way Oscar has been present for hundreds of people, the way he will continue to be present until his own time comes. And I will see you in the next story.